Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. So glad to have you here. I'm Lee Pelton. I'm president and CEO of the Boston Foundation, and it's my honor and great pleasure to welcome all of you, those of you who are here with us in the room, and then those of you who are joining us online, to this very important and exciting launch event for our 2025 Greater Boston Housing Report Card. I see many familiar faces in the audience today, and I'm very delighted you have joined us. Producing this report is a labor of love for so many people, and I want to express my profound gratitude to the incredible team of people who made this year's report possible. My brilliant colleagues from the Boston Indicators, including Luke Schuster. Everybody knows who you are, but Luke Schuster, who's here, Kimberly Goulard, Aja Kennedy, and Peter Surzak. Why don't you all stand up so we know who you are? And Sony Gupta, who leads TBF's Community Wealth portfolio of work and who, in my opinion, is one of the region's foremost housing experts. Stand up. And Sandy Kendall, TBF's talented report editor. I know I saw her earlier. There she's in the back. The team from the Initiative on Cities at Boston University, who authored this special section of the report on MBTA-C zoning, Catherine Levine Einstein, who I've met earlier, and oh, there you are, right there, and I've met her before, and Maxwell Palmer. Both of them are in front. In addition to hearing about this report this morning, we're also in for an incredible treat a few minutes from now, and we will hear remarks from one of my favorite people and leaders, Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll. And I want to thank her in advance for being with us today. And I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we're all proud of the team Massachusetts, as we call it, and grateful to, oh, there you are. We're just singing your praises. We're grateful. Very subtle entry. Yeah, I know. Your timing is impeccable. Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much for being here. And we were just expressing our gratitude for you, and I look forward to hearing your remarks very soon. Many of you have been fans of the Greater Boston Housing Report Card for years, and I think it's safe to say that the 2025 edition arrives at a pivotal moment in our city and our communities. The data in the report confirm what many residents already know from lived experience. Housing costs continue to rise faster than incomes. Housing need far exceeds production. And the gap between who can afford to stay in Greater Boston and who cannot continues to widen. But these trends are not inevitable. They reflect choices, policy choices, investment choices, and collective priorities that we have the power to change. And while I know that many of us feel like we can't do much to change what's happening in our country right now, what I know to be true in our great city and the Commonwealth is that we have the power to change what happens at the local, the regional, and the state levels. And this year's report pairs a clear-eyed view of the data with concrete paths forward. We all know that the superpower of data and measurement and analysis is that it reminds us that understanding the problem, of course, is the very first step in helping us figure out how to solve it. And what I know to be true is that if we have the civic will to work together, to solve together, to meet our housing crisis, that change is indeed possible. That change, of course, is about more than just needing more housing supply, because after all, housing is not about construction, it's about people and communities. And we must make sure that those people who make our city and our region great, our teachers, our healthcare workers, our artists, our service providers, our young families, and all of you in this room, so many others can access stable, affordable places to call home, and the opportunity to contribute to the well-being and vitality of our great communities. I have hope, as I look around this room, that we will keep people and communities at the center of our efforts, at the center of our work, as we work together to make our region a place where everyone can live and thrive. So again, thank you all so very much for being here this morning and for working together to build a greater Boston for everyone. And I hope you will find the report and today's conversation really very meaningful. And now it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to Luke, Executive Director of the Boston Indicators, to present the core metrics section of this report.
Thanks, Lee. Actually, I'm just on this, so yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Lee. Good morning, everyone. Get the creaky mic. Okay. Let me pull up on the screen the 5 key sections I'll be presenting before passing it over to the BU team to present their special topic research. Again, just want to double down on Lee's appreciation of the full Boston Indicators team. This full report, it was done collaboratively by all of us over several months. So we like to start the core metrics analysis every year by looking at who's living in the region and how that's changing over time. The first graph I'm going to show is a really simple graph of the total population of the region back to 2010, and we see pretty steady gradual population growth. You can see a little dip right after the pandemic. When we presented this data last year for 2022 and 2023, it actually showed lower levels. The Census Bureau issued some backwards revisions, and the population rebound was a little faster than we initially thought from the pandemic, so a little bit of good news here. These big population shifts are driven by changes in 2 categories. One is natural population change, the net effect of births and deaths. And the other is migration-related changes, right? People's decisions to move in and out of the region. And it's that second category where the biggest shifts happen year to year. So I'm going to show a couple of graphs drilling into that migration-related change a little bit more. This is net domestic migration over the last 20 plus years. And we can see this has been consistently negative. More people moving out of Greater Boston to other parts of the country than in. There's a lot behind a big trend like this, but one of the obvious factors here is the high cost of living in a region like Greater Boston. We did a short report about a year ago where we drilled into these trends by age, and you can see the biggest group choosing to move away is young families in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, fortunately, this has been really consistently offset by people moving in from abroad. Positive for this whole time frame and a higher spike during the Biden administration from roughly 2021 through 2024. So this yellow line is the net effect of both of those together. And over the long sort of sweep of 20 plus years, we can see the yellow bouncing sort of positive, negative, a little bit net positive over the full time frame, but not by a lot. These numbers can feel somewhat abstract. It's just lines on a graph. We released a report recently called Global Greater Boston, which puts much greater detail on who the immigrant groups are who are coming to the region. I just wanted to give a little teaser for that report if anybody's interested in more detail. One of the really cool things we included in this was an interactive map where for any city and town in the region, you can get a list of the top 5 countries of origin for the foreign-born population in that community. And the connection here with those population trends is think about how sort of more hollowed out many of our regional downtowns would be if it weren't for the Dominican community growing in a place like Lawrence, the Chinese community in Quincy, the Brazilian community in Framingham. This visual just gives you a kind of sense of how varied that story has been around the region. And it's just really important not to lose sight of how important the sort of global wave of immigration to Greater Boston has been for the resurgence of who we are as a region over the last generation. Now, obviously, we know a lot has been changing in 2025. The data I'm showing here lags by a couple of years, depending on which source we're looking at. One thing we do in the report is to try and look at the most recent real-time sources of immigration inflows to Greater Boston during 2025, things like H-1B applications, student visa issuances, deportation orders. Encourage folks to check those out in the report. I wanted to show here, though, some national data. The American Enterprise Institute with researchers at Brookings produced some population estimates of what might be happening with international immigration in 2025. And here's their high-end estimate. Their high-end estimate is that nationwide net international migration to the country is going to drop all the way down to just over 100,000 nationwide. And here's their low-end forecast. Net negative outmigration of over 500,000 people. Here's a really important piece of context for this. Natural population change nationwide in 2024, births outnumbered deaths by 520,000. If we hit that same natural population change nationwide again in 2025, and pair that with this low estimate of net international migration of negative 525,000, the United States would slip into population decline for the first time in our nation's history. So obviously, hugely consequential for who we are as a country, but this is a really big deal in a region like Greater Boston, where almost 1 in 3 residents is foreign-born. Okay, so that's the population backdrop. I want to transition now into the core housing data. So first we'll talk about supply. By now it's well established that the sort of core reason we have this rising affordability challenge is we are simply not building enough homes for all the people who'd like to live in our region. Here's some historic data on that, going all the way back to the 1960s, looking at building permits statewide. And the sort of broad trend here is just we've settled into a pattern of building permits that's far lower than what we were at historically. This is data we've relied on for the housing report card for many years. But building permits are actually not a great measure of how many homes we're actually building. One reason is a permit doesn't guarantee something actually gets built. In a period of high and rising borrowing costs, a lot of projects were getting permitted but not actually constructed. And there's also real data quality issues here where municipalities just haven't been reliably reporting this data up to the Census Bureau. Fortunately, the Census Bureau just released a new data set called the Census Address Count, which really is a much better direct measure of how many units we have nationwide. And in the report card, we present that data for the first time. So here's annual estimates of the number of net new units we've brought online in Massachusetts in the purple line, Greater Boston in the green, using this new census address count data. If you add these up over 5 years, the state added 98,000 new housing units from 2020 to 2025, 71,000 of those in Greater Boston. In the report, as we do in a bunch of different sections, we have municipal data. So this is just a teaser. Don't worry about all these specific numbers, but where you can get these estimates at the municipal level. Really important to stress, this is a new data set that we're still learning about, and actually with the government shutdown, we haven't been able to get answers to some questions we have around exactly how these numbers are being calculated. So especially don't stress the sort of 1-year changes. I'd encourage folks to focus more on the 5-year change numbers we have here. But it's clear in broad strokes, we really have built meaningful net new housing in Massachusetts over 5 years. One of the obvious questions this leads to is, if we've built 98,000 new units over the last 5 years, does that mean we're almost halfway to the state's goal of building 220,000 units statewide? I see the Lieutenant Governor shaking her head no. And the answer is no. For a really important basic reason is that goal is looking forwards 10 years. The clock just started ticking on that. That's from the statewide housing target for new homes from 2025 to 2035. And all of these units we're looking at here are kind of baked into that baseline. But there really is good news here to keep in mind. It shows that the local construction industry can build at a pace that if we kept that up annually for the next 10 years, we might really be able to meet that goal. So the question is, what are the kind of leading indicators of our ability to do that in the future? And that's where I want to come back to building permits, because flawed as they really are a leading indicator of the sort of construction industry's plans to build in the future. And so we looked at the best real-time data on building permits. Here's Greater Boston, just year to date, January to July, and we're seeing a real drop. Building permits to date are down 44% from 2021 to 2025. Why are permits down? It's a bunch of big, sort of macroeconomic headwinds. The effect of tariffs, rising the cost of construction inputs, the immigration crackdown, potentially hurting the construction labor force, and then persistently high borrowing costs. So all of that has led to real challenges moving forward. And so broad strokes across the supply section, I'd say it's a real sort of pairing of a good news, bad news story. Good news that we've built significant new housing in the last few years, making a bit of a dent in our housing shortage, but real warning signs around whether that will continue into the future. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of the homeownership market? And then I'll talk about the rental market. The story here isn't going to surprise anybody. Home prices, continue to increase. Encourage folks to check out more granular data in the report. If you look at the trend on home values statewide over the last few years, if you kind of squint at it, you can see a little bit of a leveling off in 2025. So again, a little bit of good news maybe in the last year, but they're leveling off at very high prices. So I'm going to show two maps. This first map is median single-family sale prices region-wide, and as of June 2025, 36 communities in Greater Boston had a median price of above $1 million. I think even more troubling than the data at the top end of the market is the data at the bottom end. 10 years ago, just in 2015, there were 57 communities in Greater Boston that had a median single-family sale price below $500,000. Today, that's down to only 3. Same map, but looking just at median prices for condos in Greater Boston. Prices for condos obviously a bit lower than for single-family homes, but still really high. 9 municipalities in the region are above $1 million here. In Boston, the number's at just about $840,000 for a median-priced condo. So the next thing we wanted to do in the homeownership section was to do a kind of simulation of what this means for the ability of renter households to get into entry-level homes in Greater Boston. So what I'm going to show in the next slide is a table doing this simulation. It's based off of an analysis that the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard did. I want to give them a real appreciation for helping us with this. There's a lot going on in this table. Let me just orient you to it. The columns are price changes over the last 5 years. And then the first 3 rows I'm showing here are the key inputs for the cost of a monthly payment on an entry-level home. If you look just at the first row here, the entry-level home price, this is not median sale prices in Greater Boston. This is the typical price for a home at the bottom third of the market. And even homes at the bottom third of the market are up by over $100,000 in just 4 years. Then we've got closing costs in the down payment. And then the other big driver in recent years of costs going up is interest rates more than doubling. They've actually gone down a little bit since 2023, but comparing 2025 to 2021, still up by more than double. So here's what this means in terms of the sort of estimated cost of that monthly payment. Up by over $1,600 a month to almost $4,200 a month in 2025 to afford just an entry-level home in Greater Boston. And then we take these numbers and say, well, what would you need in terms of annual income so that those monthly payments don't make up more than 30% of that income? That's up to over $160,000 a year just to afford that entry-level home. And then let me show another table oriented somewhat similarly, but this is just estimates of how many renter households in Greater Boston can afford those prices. The top row is that annual income needed again. We break it out for different racial categories. If you first just look at that bottom row, you see that we've cut by almost half the number of renter households who can afford an entry-level home in just 4 years. Also look as one example for black households in 2025, we estimate just a little bit over 8,000 black families that are renter households in Greater Boston can currently afford an entry-level home. So a whole lot of dire consequences of these trends in recent years. One of them is that young families are delaying further and further into the future their ability to buy their first home. The National Association of Realtors just released data nationwide showing that in 2025, the median age of first-time homebuyers in the United States reached 40. That was down to just 31 about 10 years ago. So you see in the discourse how much affordability politics are taking over the political discourse right now. This is one graph that provides good evidence for why that is. Okay, rents. I'll do this a little bit more quickly. It's a similar story to the home price one. This looks at typical rents. It's a blended measure for all different types of units in Greater Boston compared to the major metro areas in the country. Really steady increases. There was a dip during the pandemic in most metro areas, but that was very short-lived. In Greater Boston, we have the 5th highest prevailing rents of any metro area in the country, just a tick under $3,000 today. The main reason for this is there just aren't that many rental units available. This looks at rental vacancy rates in Greater Boston compared to a subset of cities, and we have the very lowest rental vacancy rate as of 2024. And when there are just very few units available at any point in time, that gives landlords, far more leverage to push up prices. It also opens up the door for discrimination, right? If landlords have much more leverage, they are able to be much choosier about who they pick. So this sets up really terrible conditions for renter households. This data ends in 2024. There's a little evidence that in 2025, in some small neighborhoods around college campuses, vacancy rates may have ticked up a little bit. We've got data in the report. Again, this is just a teaser. Don't worry about digesting all of this. But this is changes in prevailing rents across a bunch of neighborhoods in the metro core over the last 4 years. And again, depending on which neighborhood you look at, you might see a little bit of slowing in the increase in 2025, but pretty consistent increases across the board over 4 years. And then finally, let me end with homelessness and housing instability. There's more in the report than I'm going to show here. We've got data on evictions and foreclosures in particular. I want to give a huge shout out actually to the Center for Housing Data at Mass Housing Partnership that does a great housing instability monitor that get updated regularly with much more granular data on some of this at the municipal level. Here I'm just going to show first top line trends in homelessness in Greater Boston. You can see the huge spike in homelessness in 2024, a little decline in 2025, but still at really elevated rates. This data is based on a point-in-time count at one evening in late January. So the 2025 point here, I think, was just like a week into the new Trump administration. So doesn't give us good data on what's happening through 11 months of this year. One place we do have a little bit better, more real-time data is on the state's shelter caseloads. This is a graph of that. You can see the big spike in sort of late 2023 through 2024 as a result of the migrant crisis, families fleeing hardship abroad, coming here without the ability to get a work permit. That's declined really rapidly through 2025. I actually saw a press release recently. I think we've got the number here for July. I think as of maybe October, it's down even more to something like 2,500 families. So maybe good news here. I think the big question here is, where have those families gone? If they've shifted into permanent housing, that's a good news story. If they've shifted into unsheltered homelessness or been forced to go back to their home countries, that's more troubling. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and just end with a QR code for folks. If you're interested in receiving research like this from Boston Indicators and you're not already on our list, please check that out. I'd say top line across all of this, the big story is a period of real uncertainty. We know that 2025 has been a year of great shifts in our communities and society, and housing is an area where that's playing out as well. With that, I'd like to invite Katie Einstein, professor at BU, to present the special topic research.
So we're really excited to be here today to talk with you guys about MBTAC and the rollout of this incredibly important state policy across the Commonwealth. So there's been a lot of media attention, understandably, about these communities, those yellow ones there, the non-compliant communities, right? A lot of ink has been spilled about Milton, about Winthrop, and the political drama those communities have had in trying to get compliant plans passed. But what Max and I have been really interested in understanding is not those yellow communities that have outright defied state law. What we have studied in this report is how much variation we see in those green communities, right? Because underneath this sort of illusion of similarity, there's actually a lot of really important differences in how communities have complied with this law and what it might mean for the production of housing and the efficacy of this ambitious and important state legislation, right? So the key findings that I hope you guys take away from this research is that there's a huge amount of variation among these compliers, and it's going to have really important consequences for the efficacy of this law. As an outline, we're going to start with an overview of what has happened across all 177 MBTAC communities, and then we follow this up with detailed case studies of Lexington, Needham, and Wellesley to really understand what's going on underneath the hoods. Our key findings are that some communities have intentionally zoned for growth, while others very deliberately have not. Most cities and towns completely avoided single-family neighborhoods. There's very little upzoning taking place in those communities, even when they're right next door to commuter rail stops. We also found in some communities they were able to use really effective public outreach strategies to lead to really high levels of housing production. We also found in some cases that state policies were weaponized by housing opponents as a tool for outright blocking new housing development. We also found, and this is a place where I think we have the most sort of understanding already from media accounts, that local ballot referendums and even the threat of referendums are really hard challenges for housing advocates and something that makes it very difficult to build new housing even when we have ambitious laws. And so I want to invite my colleague Max Palmer to come up to talk a little bit about some of our overview findings before we get into the case studies.
So there's really interesting variation that we were able to explore across the MBTA communities. And one thing that's fascinating about this process is that because every town had to draft its own plan and then submit it to the state for approval, for review, is that the state, each town submitted a tremendous amount of data and information to the state. And that goes down to the individual level, parcel level of data. We know every single parcel that was included in an MBTA community zone, and equally important, every parcel that wasn't included. And each parcel represents a choice that the town made to include something in a zone or not. And so we were able to get all this data from the state, which is just a tremendous resource that I think will lead to a lot of other really important analyses and insights in the future, and we hope to do some of those in the coming months. But I want to highlight two really important data points for you today. The first one is what percentage of the mandated capacity of how many units the towns were required to zone for did they choose to ultimately do. And so the minimum for any compliant town is going to be 100%. And on the left here, we can see a cluster of a few towns that truly went for the bare minimum, by which I mean within 1 to 5 units of the minimum number, of the minimum possible capacity. And we list a few of those in the report. These are places that said we have to do this, and we are not going to go a single unit more than is necessary. At the other end, we see some places that went for more than double the required units, places that at least embraced the potential of new zoning. So understanding this variation is important. Why did some communities choose the bare minimum? Why did a lot choose a little bit more and not choose the bare minimum? And then this handful at the end that really seemed to embrace the task and allowed for a lot of potential new units. Then we look to see which parcels did they choose to include in the MBTA community zones. And if we look across all the towns, we see something really striking. In a plurality of the towns, about half of the towns, they didn't upzone a single parcel that's currently used as a single-family residence. Not a single one. In the places that are least dense, the parts of the towns that have the fewest people, even when they are directly next to transit, we did not see any upzoning. So a lot of towns completely ignored or deliberately excluded these single-family areas. And these are places with potential to add a lot of density. Then we see another large cluster here at less than 10%, where they included some single-family areas, especially those or parcels that are very close to commercial and industrial areas, but very little otherwise, and then just a handful that went into the higher areas. And so if we think about MBTA communities as striving to create more density, what we see is that the denser areas, multifamily buildings or commercial industrial areas, were upzoned, and single-family areas, even when directly next to a commuter rail station, were left out.
So to further underscore, right, these points that Max has made about variations in compliance, I'm going to present a little bit of data now from our 3 key case studies. So I'm starting here just outlining sort of an overview of sort of what happened in each of these communities. So in Lexington, they passed an ambitious plan that zoned well above the minimum requirement and actually included some single-family neighborhoods. They've recently scaled back that plan, but even with the scale back, because of all of the units currently in the pipeline, they will likely produce thousands of new units of housing as a consequence of that initially ambitious upzoning. In Needham, they actually passed a very initially ambitious plan in town meeting that was ultimately overturned in a ballot referendum and was then replaced with something that they called, sort of in a very accurate description, the base compliance plan. Okay, that's neither of these plans, I want to stress, even that initially ambitious plan included single-family neighborhoods, which Needham viewed as a political non-starter to sort of tackle those neighborhoods. Finally, in Wellesley, they had a no-drama sort of fight over their MBTAC plan. They went for compliance right from the get-go. But in practice, this plan, while it is compliant with state law, will allow for very little new housing beyond what was already in the pipeline in Wellesley. And like Needham, they have not touched any of the single-family neighborhoods in Wellesley, even those that are quite close to commuter rail stops. To sort of show you where this is on a map, right, the big takeaway to have here, sort of the things to look for, right, are the places that are upzoned, right? These little purple dots are single-family upzoned areas. And so here in Lexington, you can see there's some small pockets of those purple areas, sort of single-family communities that are upzoned. You can also see from this map, right, the large swaths of yellow and green, that lots of parts of Lexington were upzoned under their initially approved plan, right? So this is a plan that is affecting a lot of Lexington, including some single-family neighborhoods. You're not going to see any of those purple dots again in any of the other maps that I show you, okay? So take a good look at the purple. All right, so over here in Needham, you can see, right, that there are not a lot of sort of the upzoning is less sort of spread across the community. And you can see for some of the stops, right, if we look at some of these commuter rail stops, that there's less ambitious upzoning as a consequence of those areas being more dominated by single-family housing. That pattern is sort of even more striking, right, when we look over at Wellesley, where here again, you see these single-family neighborhoods that are not upzoned, right? So over here in Wellesley Farms, that commuter rail stop was essentially untouched in the MBTAC plan because it was predominantly single-family neighborhoods, right? The other sort of feature to notice about this plan is a lot of the upzoning happened near the Waban commuter rail stop, where there was already a development called the Nines in the pipeline. And so Wellesley was actually able to comply with the state law largely by sort of designating a district where they already had a large multifamily development going in that had been permitted. So to dig in a little bit more deeply and sort of outline what worked in these communities, I want to highlight a few sort of strategies about what worked and what sort of posed obstacles to having an effective rollout of the state legislation. So one piece that was really helpful for Lexington is they had actually just completed a comprehensive planning process in which they had approved as a town ambitious housing growth targets. And so Max and I consider ourselves people who've read maybe too many meeting minutes over the course of our careers. We spent a lot of time analyzing public meetings. One thing that really struck us looking at these Lexington public meetings was how productive they were, how constructive they were, and how many sort of different voices, both pro-housing and people who were like a little more skeptical, were involved in the dialogue about MBTAC. Town officials also told us they use Zoom as a means of making sure that public officials maybe didn't feel quite as intimidated by some of the angrier voices in the room, which is unfortunately something that did happen in some neighboring communities, right? We also saw in Lexington, which happens to be home to a number of state and local leaders, a lot of strong support from those officials at town meeting, which I think also helped to build a strong coalition for an ambitious upzoning. Turning to the question of state policies, right, sort of a second key finding from the report, the use of state policies sort of being weaponized by housing opponents, I want to flag sort of what happened in Needham and in their ballot referendum in particular to show how state policies can be used as a way of opposing housing. So Needham, as I mentioned, initially passed an ambitious upzoning plan that targeted growth. But after that town meeting vote, there was a well-organized ballot referendum campaign that emphasized, the real sort of emphasis of this was fiscal challenges, especially in schools, that might stem from growth. I want to stress we actually have good empirical evidence in Massachusetts that building new housing does not seem to increase school costs, right? But regardless of the veracity of these claims, they were really important in the ballot referendum. And so some town officials said if they had to do it over again, they would have focused more on building a coalition, supporting housing growth, using sort of fiscal arguments and focusing still on people, but maybe less about sort of helping people find affordable housing and also emphasizing some of the fiscal benefits of building more housing. Okay. Building on sort of how different communities managed housing opposition, Wellesley seemed to anticipate, right, that a number of people in the community might be opposed to housing, right? And their guiding principle in getting a plan passed was that it has to pass town meeting, that was sort of their mantra, and that was very much their approach. And so folks told us, right, that it wasn't really a plan that was going to change all that much. And so there wasn't a lot of opposition because the density and allowable building wasn't really changing a lot in the town. And so unlike in Needham, which proposed this very ambitious plan, we actually didn't see a lot of opposition in Wellesley because people figured out pretty quickly that while this plan would comply with state law, it wasn't going to change a whole lot, right? So one challenge that we can think about in sort of how we deal with these referendum, if we don't want to go the Wellesley approach, right, as a community that actually, if we want to build housing, is that, shocking maybe to folks in the room who love talking about zoning, most people actually don't want to spend hours of their lives talking about zoning. And so one challenge we have when we pass state policies like MBTAC, and we have so many meetings about getting these plans passed through town meeting, is people at some point, because it's natural, are going to lose interest when you get to a referendum campaign. And that may be something that happened in a number of the communities. It's not just Needham that sort of struggled with these ballot referendum, right? And I think that's something that we, as folks who want to build more housing, need to think about, sort of how do we structure conversations? Obviously, we can't generate endless interest about zoning, but how do we get people to be willing to sort of continue those conversations in the face of a lot of opposition, right? And again, I want to stress here, Needham was not alone. They were the focus of our report as a case study, but housing generally really struggles when it's put to the voters in off-cycle referendums. It's been a trend we've seen over the last couple of years. So just in conclusion, to highlight our key findings, big variation in what compliance looks like. The politics of upzoning is generally very difficult, and it's nearly impossible, seemingly, in single-family neighborhoods. But I want to end with sort of a positive note, right? Keep in mind this Lexington example. Upzoning can work and be incredibly effective, even if it's ultimately scaled back, because it can make it easier to build new housing. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Sony.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Great to see this room. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Katie and Max, for those terrific presentations that distilled so much information in such an accessible manner. And I'm looking forward to digging into, I think we're all looking forward to digging into some of those details with you. I want to echo Lee Pendleton's warm welcome here to everyone who is in person and also all of those who've joined us online. I want to lift up Lee's emphasis on what's behind the numbers and the data and what housing is about. It's about people and communities, and more about that in a minute. But before bringing up our main speaker, I want to thank the people in the Boston Foundation community as well who helped produce the report, in addition to the researchers from the Boston Foundation, from the Boston Indicators. So Mel Nagashima, thank you for helping pull this off. Keith Mahoney, Sandy Kendall, Ted McEnroe, Michelle Hinkle, Jordan Nummy, Mimi Huckins. Please wave to everybody. Thank you. You're an amazing team. And one person who centers people and communities in everything she does is Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll. Long before she took on the official role in leading Team Massachusetts with Governor Healy, she was championing people in the community in Salem, Massachusetts. She was championing affordable housing production, inclusionary zoning, ADUs, and community outreach and education about the need for housing. So it's only fitting that the state's largest investment in housing, the $5.1 billion Affordable Homes Act, teaming with housing policies such as ADUs as of right across the state, would be signed into law in her time as Lieutenant Governor. Please welcome Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll to share her observations.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a thrill to be with you with so many housing advocates and folks who are doing the work in communities as well, and really grateful for the Boston Foundation and the work they do. I always feel like the Boston Foundation is a bit of our conscience. You're really helping guide, like, what do we really need to know and how do we get there? And I love data-informed policy. So Luke, thank you, and our friends from BU, thank you for the work you're doing to help inform some of the data behind how we actually get to housing policy. You know, I think since the governor and I were fortunate enough to take office, we've really seen housing and the need for more housing as our biggest challenge. And that's true no matter where you are. We're talking about Boston and greater Boston, but I'm out in Western Mass a fair amount, and Central Mass and the South Coast. No matter what community I'm in or the governor's in, we hear a lot about housing unavailability, housing affordability challenges, even in places where housing might be a little bit more affordable. It's really not more affordable to the people living there. So we also have heard consistently from the business community the challenges of attracting talent, retaining talent, keeping talent. And that is a little bit new. When I started as mayor, we talked about housing because we wanted to be a community that supported housing and the people that we rely on every day. What we've seen as the last decade not having built enough housing, we now see a business imperative that we're not going to be able to keep and attract the talent that we need. So it's pretty clear, like everything that is important to this Commonwealth, it intersects around housing and the lack of it. It's in the middle of our economic policy for us. It's our healthcare policy, our competitiveness, and addressing really the means to move Massachusetts forward is going to take us all digging in and digging deeper on housing. And that's why I'm excited to be here, as the Boston Foundation reinforces that message and helps us as an administration understand how those policies that we're making are impacting communities on the ground, and collectively how we can problem solve. And we can problem solve. Like, there are lots of intractable challenges within government. Building more housing isn't one of them. It really isn't. It should not be as hard as it is. And I think for us to solve this, we've got to work together. And that means local officials, state officials, certainly who are in a position to drive policy, folks who are building housing, those that are developing housing. There is a path forward. Some of that is with carrots, some of that is with sticks, but right now, as I look around this room, there's plenty of people who could help us drive a collective opportunity forward to address the biggest challenge in our state. So let me just take a minute to share some of the work that's already underway beyond what was talked about. You know, it is true that we have always wanted communities to have their own housing production plans, and frankly, in Salem, that was our aha moment, when people realized, oh, let's look at our data and our demographics and see what type of housing we don't have, what we do have, and what we need. People began to realize in a city as old as ours, some of our most desirable neighborhoods were crafted before zoning, right? Beautiful homes, Federalist-style mansions, carriage houses, and the like, places where people want to live. I could not recreate those neighborhoods because of zoning. Somehow zoning became a Bible that really wasn't helpful in terms of delivering on the promises we made for the way people actually like to live and where they want to live. We thought it was important that the state have a comprehensive housing plan. We always wanted cities to have their own housing production plans, looking at their data, understanding the type of housing they need, but we never had one in the state. And that's why we now know we need 220,000 housing units to keep up with growth. It shows what we can do over the next 10 years by region. It breaks it out. Where have we been building, where have we not? And the type of housing we need. You know, 20% of the population in Massachusetts is over the age of 60. We're all living longer, hooray. But we're going to need different types of housing. what you need when you're 20 is different than when you're 40, and definitely different than when you're 80. So this comprehensive housing plan, we're so grateful that it's completed. We know it can really drive housing education and housing production in regions and make sure we're building the type of housing we need across the Commonwealth. We think it's a reachable goal, again, if we dig in and work together to achieve it. That's one of the reasons the Affordable Homes Act, which came before the housing plan, is so critical, because it not only is it's $5.2 billion, not that 5.1 is important too, but it's $5.2 billion. It's the largest housing investment we've made in the state's history. It is helping us drive things like tax credits in gateway cities that have always had a tougher time penciling out. We're seeing tremendous growth in gateway cities in terms of housing. It's also helping us support the amount of public housing we already own. Massachusetts owns the most public housing of any state in the country. At a time when HUD was actually still building housing in the 50s and the 60s, we actually doubled down as a state and built a fair amount of state-owned housing units. You know them in your housing authorities for sure. They're also housing the most number of older adults and seniors in that housing unit. And a lot of it was built in the 50s and 60s, so you know what that means. It needs to be upgraded, it needs to be enhanced. We are putting housing authorities on fuel. We are not only modernizing and updating units, we're adding to a lot of units on land already owned by housing authorities and leveraging that to produce not only more affordable housing, but a lot of mixed income communities, opportunities to grow our family housing at affordable levels that we need. That was also built into that Affordable Homes Act. So how do we build more? How do we take care of what we have? And how do we advance sort of new ways of building housing? More money for supportive housing models. No one says, I can't wait to grow old and go to a nursing home. Most people, right? So how do we make sure we're building more supportive housing? We don't have a bed for you. It's more expensive. There's just a lot of tools at our disposal as a result of this housing bond bill. And I'm really grateful that we were able to come together with housing advocates, local leaders, members of the legislature to push forward on this agenda. It also included accessory dwelling units. This has been a fairly underutilized tool in Massachusetts. ADUs, in-law apartments, call them what you like. We think these are a big opportunity to add to those single-family neighborhoods that were not impacted as much as we would like through 3A zoning to create additional spaces, whether that's for the older adult who may own the home or for somebody in your community who needs a rental unit. In Massachusetts, we think this could add up to 10,000 units over the next 5 years. We have seen it happen in California. Everyone's got a little casita in the backyard in California. Like, there's more we can do here, and we're really trying to encourage that. There's a number of banks partnering to make lower interest loans. We know there are modular units. Like, this is a space that we see opportunities for growth. The MBTA Communities Law, we certainly spent a lot of time talking about that. It has been a source of inspiration and at times a source of frustration, but we know this is requiring communities to think more concretely about the type of housing they have, particularly if they have a public good. If you've got public transportation, Wellesley has 4 commuter rail stops, 4. In Salem, we have the busiest commuter rail stop in the MBTA system. Highest numbers of passengers, most numbers of trains. We have the benefit of having 2 trains. We should be able to build more housing in communities that have public transit and where we have the space to do that. We know it's created, I would say, opportunities to have conversations about housing in a number of places. Some have embraced that more than others. But the fact that we're talking about housing, that we're asking people in communities to think about who is living in their community, who isn't, how are they going to provide for their future housing needs is really, really important. And that's why 158 communities have said yes. We do focus, or some folks focus on those who have said no. There are a heck of a lot more who have said yes, who are doing the hard work. And I see members of our HLC team. Thank you, Chris. Thank you others who are here who are leading this effort. You should know that we used to not have one whole cabinet secretariat just focused on housing, and it's housing and livable communities. Because I want to be clear as a former mayor, it's not build anything, anyhow, anywhere. That serves nobody well. We want smart growth housing. We want opportunities for communities to decide where is their housing growth going to happen that is beneficial to them. The idea is not to drag communities by the ear to creating housing in their communities. It's to recognize that you need more housing. And how do we capture hearts and minds around that? If you are pro-housing, you're standing up for the people that you rely on most in your community who can't afford to live there at current. And that's many of the people that you rely on. Who are you dropping your kids off to in the morning? Who's helping take care of an older adult? Anybody who hands you anything over the counter. The heroes during COVID who were checking us out at the grocery store, like, they need to live in our communities too. Let's talk about where and how do we do that collectively, because it makes your community better. I'll also say, as someone who was the mayor of a gateway city in Salem, very historic place, first millionaire in America hailed for Salem. We weren't so great to women in 1692, but we've come a long way since then. What attracted me to Salem, and I'm not a native of Massachusetts, I'm a Navy brat, so grew up in lots of different places, born in Hawaii. Like many people, came to Massachusetts to go to college and just fell in love with a community that was hip and historic and had this rich history and was so welcoming and inclusive. Lots of different people from different places, speaking different languages, living in different means. We had those wonderful Federalist-style mansions around the corner from more of the tenement houses where people worked on the docks. It gives a place some authenticity and some character. And one of the reasons I fought so hard for building housing in Salem for a broad cross-section is because if we only build housing for very affluent people, it changes the character of the place that you fell in love with. And I don't want that to happen to Massachusetts. We've got to build more housing. We've got to do it smartly. We got to make sure it's serving the people that we need in our communities across a broad spectrum. So that's why we're really thrilled to not only have the investment we made in the Affordable Homes Act, but the opportunity to have some policies behind it in real partnership with cities and towns. I get and understand local autonomy, wanting to be able to drive your community forward. There's nobody who knows their community better than folks on the ground locally. But we can't say no to housing as a policy and think we're serving our community or our collective communities and certainly our Commonwealth well. And that's why we're excited to take on statewide policies like the use of state-owned land. There have been attempts in the past to use state-owned land to put that to use for housing, but it didn't turn on with everyone. Some of the most valuable state-owned land we have is owned by our state universities, our community colleges, our state universities, our UMass system, land that they don't use as much. Bridgewater State has a commuter rail on campus, commuter rail station on campus. Many of our community colleges have more land than they have space availability. We're in conversations right now in Wellesley. You may have read some about in the paper about their community college, very close to a commuter rail station. How do we develop and use spaces like that for more land? We've got an RFP out. Part of the Affordable Homes Act made it easier to develop state-owned land. It used to be if we wanted to sell a piece of state-owned land, you actually had to go get a piece of legislation to do it. One parcel, getting legislature passed. Now to build housing, we've made that easier with the Affordable Homes Act. You don't have to go to the legislature for every single parcel. It sets some standards for how much housing you have to build on that parcel if you're building it for housing. And we think with 450 acres of land out already, nearly 3 dozen sites, that could build 3,500 homes. RFPs are out. We're doing public bidding processes. DCAM is leading this, and we have a lot of partners who own that land who are seeing opportunities. How can I make investments in my public higher ed campus and have housing? We think this is a big deal to help put affordable housing and put the type of housing we need in our communities in a place where it's not coming from a disadvantage or a scarcity mindset, that it's allowing us to look at this data and these statistics and say, how do we get more housing starts? How do we ensure we're building housing across the state? And how do we build it faster? The one mission the governor has been clear about to those of us who work on housing in the administration is more and faster. So how do we look at barriers? As part of the Affordable Homes Act, we also had a commission that looked at unlocking potential and reducing barriers. Some of that is us. We've just proposed regulations to reduce the MEPA process for building housing for something that could take 6 to 18 months to 35 days without lowering our environmental standards. We're saying you can get in the fast lane if you're building housing. We know what that mitigation is going to look like. Let's just get to it a lot quicker. I'm proud of the work that we're doing because I know it's going to have an impact on people we need in our community, on solving this housing crisis, and in moving Massachusetts forward. But this is a team sport for sure. I'm wearing my very hokey Team Massachusetts bracelet, and I do think our talent is our superpower here. We have an administration that truly believes, hey, none of us are as smart as all of us. How do we put talent around the table to help us solve this? Building housing, developing housing, people in communities. How do we have hard conversations? The communities that have had the most success, they're hosting cocktail parties and over-the-fence conversations around what it means to say yes to housing. How do we do this the right way? How do we ensure when we think about dry topics like zoning, former land use lawyer, and I still think it's dry, right? How do we ensure that we're engaging with people about what this means to them and their community? Who is helped and who is harmed by our policies? That's the way we make change in Massachusetts. And we're not done. There's more work to do. We're excited to get to it and to continue it and to help. As I said, capturing those hearts and minds is critical for us, using data to inform how we do that, and then working with the smartest people building housing to say we can bring innovation to this, we can utilize some of our assets better, and we can ensure that we have communities that are driving forward with both a high quality of life and an opportunity for the people we rely on the most to live there. And just one caveat on this, as somebody who now has 3 20-somethings in my house. Well, they're not all in my house, thank goodness. If you think about what our 20-year-olds, like our biggest outmigration is 26 to 35-year-olds. You saw that number, right? They're leaving to go to places that are more affordable because they want to do the thing that most of us did when we were 26 to 35 years old. Just build a house, put down roots, start a family. Think about who is impacted by this housing policy. Those 20-somethings who are making choices not to be here or not to buy a home or not to start a family. How that impacts talent. This generation is leaving college with higher debt than we've ever seen because the cost of college has gone up instrumentally. They're entering into a world where the cost of housing, even if you're making a lot of money, is really hard to purchase a home, to put down roots. And they're making choices with their feet to go someplace else. That is not, I am not okay with that. It might be the first generation to do worse than their parents if we don't tackle this problem. And it is not unique to Massachusetts. It is not unique to Boston and Greater Boston. You can talk about any capital city and they're having an affordability crisis around housing. So this is an us challenge and it's an us opportunity. If we come together, I firmly believe we can develop the housing that we need, keep those young folks here, ensure that they're contributing to our talent pool, and that they are experiencing what our parents did to us, made life a little bit better, a little bit easier, and that hope for that next generation that's going to do better than the one before. We can do it. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say here. This is amazing, but if you could please have a seat here and the researchers join me. We're doing things a little differently. I'm going to, as moderator, share a couple of questions for our folks here, but we brought our researchers up because they do amazing work, and we want to have the opportunity for you all to ask them even more questions. And of course, the Lieutenant Governor, the amazing font of knowledge that she is, covered the gamut of so many things. So I'll throw out a few questions, and then we will have more time for your questions than we typically do. So save those questions, and again, questions end with a question mark. Please do not use that time to expound on your theory of housing change in the community. So thank you all. So thank you all, and for the amazing work that you do, and Lieutenant Governor for that wide-ranging explanation of why we all need to focus on housing. Let me start with you, Luke. You talked about in the report the vacancy rates around Northeastern potentially increasing a little bit, but then you also talk about tanking versus a strategic increase in housing that lowers vacancy rates over a very sort of period of time. Can you talk a little bit more about that effect and how we're all aiming for higher vacancy rates than we currently have, which is 3% in the rental market, but how getting there is important, not just getting to a number?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one way to think about it is it is basic supply and demand dynamics that we face. And one way to reduce costs could be to reduce demand. If we have fewer immigrants coming to our region, and that happens at such a magnitude that it materially reduces the number of folks looking to rent an apartment or to buy a home, that could help moderate prices. It's just a really bad way to address the problem. Far better would be to allow the region to continue growing, to continue thriving. All the new folks who might come to the region, again, it's both welcoming new immigrants from abroad, but also fending off the number of people who've been moving away. If we could retain that population, we're going to have a much stronger local economy. We're going to have more people to patronize local Main Streets businesses. We're going to have a stronger tax base to fund our public schools. I mean, a big issue region-wide right now is the number of communities who are having to go in front of the voters for a Prop 2.5 overrides to fund their public schools. A reduction in immigrants to the region might help on the margin a little bit in the short term on prices, but it's just not the best way to do it. And by far better would be to just simply build more housing to welcome all the families who'd like to be here. Another thing to keep in mind, I'm sure folks have seen this in the broader national discourse, but there are real concerns around congressional redistricting after the coming 2030 census. Massachusetts is a state that's had sort of moderate population growth. We aren't projected to lose representation in 2030. why not be a state that actually strives to gain congressional representation into the future? There's a big sort of fight for the soul of our country happening right now, and I'd love to be on that side of the ledger.
I love it. That's a whole new look at getting more power in Congress. So really appreciate it. So building on the pressures of migration loss, as well as the other pressures on construction, Lieutenant Governor, cost of materials, tariffs, potentially the impact on the labor force with these immigration changes. What do you see as some of the strategies, and you mentioned some of them, but what do you see as some of the strategies for addressing the cost of housing?
I think this is definitely a challenge in Massachusetts. Both the process of developing housing is one aspect of that, and obviously cost of materials and how we build. I think that we're focused on our Unlocking Potential Commission's report that talked about some of the process challenges we have, whether that's through permitting and it takes too long. If it is taking a year to get a project approved, and sometimes it's longer than that, those are a lot of carrying costs that add to and contribute to the cost of what those units actually cost. Even when we're building affordable housing, which the state is subsidizing, those costs are continuing to grow, which means we're able to build less of it with the resources that we have. So anything we can do to drive down cost on the process side, we certainly are focused on that. The MEPA process is one aspect of that. There's a whole other series of things that we're looking at in terms of permitting and timelines and how we reduce that. Half our cabinet is reading Abundance by Ezra Klein. Like, it is about outcomes, not process. How do we get there? I think the other aspect is bringing some innovation to how we build. We haven't looked at modular or implemented modular as much. Will that save money? That is that also comes with challenges. We have a lot of these unintended consequences. Adding stretch codes and energy codes has increased some of the cost of housing for some of the places that they build. We want to build housing resiliently. How do we do that in a more affordable way? And what does that balance look like? What are those trade-offs? How do we navigate for that moving forward? I think those are areas where we think the state can provide some additional data and components to help drive either policy shifts or thinking about things like density bonuses if you want inclusionary zoning. You just can't add the layer of the cost to build. We've got to also look at what the trade-offs are to actually getting units completed.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of those strategies. And as you said, also the smart growth part of it is we have this incredible infrastructure and resource in the T. How can we build more around the T for reasons of access, equity, and efficiency? Katie and Max, just a quick comment, and I think this will also be a question for the Lieutenant Governor. Lee spoke about housing being about people and communities, and then we have a comment from Needham, the select board member, who said, oh, I wish I hadn't focused on people. Mm-hmm. I wish I'd talked about dollars and cents. Any thoughts about how to make that effective conversation, to have that effective conversation? I know over the years we've talked about how do we sell this and how, what's the case making around housing. But in your travels and on all the meeting minutes that you read, is there anything you can offer that was more impactful? And then I'll turn to the Lieutenant Governor, in your travels around the state, what you might have heard that would be helpful.
So there have been so many academic researchers who've tried to study these questions, who've done lots of public opinion surveys, done lots of message testing to try to figure out, like, what is our silver bullet? What is that message that will actually sort of work in all communities and persuade people to build more housing? And I think the answer we're starting to get from that research is the correct message is going to depend on the community that you're in and what the issues of that community are, right? And so what works to get more housing built in Roxbury is going to look really different than what works in Needham. And so I know Max and I certainly believe this, and I suspect everyone in this room believes this, that housing is fundamentally about people. But the message that might resonate the most with some folks is maybe partially about people, but also partially about what the costs of new housing might mean to their communities. So when I think about that quote from Needham, I don't think it's at all about sort of devaluing the benefits to people that housing produces. It's sort of about what is the message that resonates most with the community, and how do we assuage some of the fears that people have, correct or not, about what building new housing might mean to their communities. I don't know, Max, if you...
Yeah, just one thing to add to that. I'm also a town meeting member in Arlington. So I see both on the academic side and then also in the debates that my town has about housing. And one thing that comes up is everybody agrees we need more affordable housing, regardless of what that means. And there's a broad opposition to what they call luxury housing. But one thing that struck me from Luke's presentation, if we look at the cost of the median house, or the median condo, and not an expensive one on the scale, but are objectively expensive. And everyone has their own model in their head of what housing should cost and what fancy housing costs. And I think most people think $1 million house is luxury housing, or $1 million condo is luxury. But if that's the median in your community, that's not luxury. That might just be a marketing word. So I think making people understand the cost of all housing in their community, not what they paid when they moved in or what they pay now, the cost of adding to it, and sort of how steep it is to reframe what it means to build market rate housing, what it actually costs.
I think just one point I also wanted to add on what are we doing to help drive down the cost. We've started something called the Momentum Fund. This is a way for the state to take a piece of the capital stack to really drive down what it costs to build housing. It has been so successful in terms of units that are permitted and ready to go but just can't pencil out. So there is innovation happening to drive down the cost. But on this particular issue, I think we have a lot of myth busting to do around how we fund schools. Many of our suburban districts are seeing declining school enrollment. We're just not having as many kids. And yet we fund schools on a per capita or per student basis, which means if you are adding housing, you are not necessarily hurting the dynamics of resources that you have to educate students in your district. You actually might be helping dramatically if you're seeing declining enrollment. Two, just the value of new growth. If I said to a community, I'm looking to build a new business here and it's going to create this many new jobs, most people are super excited and see this as an opportunity. If I say I'm going to build a new apartment building and it's going to create this many units, you get a different answer often. Market rate units can pay more than some underutilized commercial building in terms of tax revenue helping support the cost of governing, from schools to public safety to public maintenance. And every community I know needs more money on July 1st than they needed the July 1st before to just take on the normal levels of service that you do before you do anything new. So we've seen lots of battles of how to fund schools, how to fund basic government. It is a challenge when you have inflation happening. The answer is new growth in many places to help support the cost of rising equipment, supplies, and labor. And yet we don't think of new housing in that framework. It's thought of as something that's more of a negative than a positive. And the last point I'll make is I think data is important, that myth busting, and also being honest with folks. Being able to say, yes, it is going to take me 5 minutes longer to get home when that old leather factory or old mill is turned into housing. I stipulate that's a trade-off I'm willing to live with because it's going to create something useful in our community. It's going to clean up a brownfield. Like, there's lots of reasons to say yes, but yes, it's going to impact the travel time that it might take me to get from someplace, as opposed to trying to convince people we're not going to have impacts. There are, but I think the positives outweigh the negatives. We never really get there sometimes, and I think it's important for us to, as people who support housing, also recognize that there are impacts from some of that, and they're not all bad.
Thank you. Absolutely, the myth busting, the number of times you hear traffic and schools, and I know Katie and Max in your special section have talked about there is no data to support that the cost of your schools is going to go up. If anything, you can help declining enrollment. And yes, your traffic might increase a little bit. There's nothing that says that all traffic delays have to be concentrated in Boston or in cities. So a few extra minutes will be okay for the trade-off. So as promised, we're going to open it up for questions. Again, we have an amazing set of folks here. Folks, please use them, mind their minds, and phrase your questions accordingly. And we have amazing mic runners here, Sam and Keith, thank you. So open it up.
Hi.
Rachel.
Rachel Heller from CHAPA. I will keep in mind not to editorialize. I have two questions. Katie, Max, you know I am super fans of all of your research. So just hearkening back to neighborhood defenders and seeing how few people turned out in support of housing development with MBTA communities, did you see a shift? And is that one of the reasons why we saw Lexington and Needham actually get things past town meeting? My second part of that question is probably more for the Lieutenant Governor related to what you just said, the role of misinformation and how that might have impacted debates.
So yeah, one of the points in our book that we wrote about how the folks who show up to public meetings are deeply unrepresentative of their broader communities, and they're overwhelmingly opposed to new housing. And part of the reason for that is the scale at which decisions were made, right? That if we have public meetings about individual housing developments, that is of course going to incentivize sort of the folks who are experiencing the concentrated costs of new development. And I think one exciting thing that happened in a lot, not all, unfortunately, but in a lot of MBTAC communities, is because the discussions were happening at a city or town level, it was much easier for housing advocates to organize and to get folks out to attend those public meetings. And so in a number of places, the meetings, I think Lexington was sort of a real standout, but in a lot of the places, we saw a lot more pro-housing voices than you would see at a typical neighborhood meeting about, a 4-unit building being put in down the street, right? So I think as much as possible, if the state can help to create situations where cities and towns are talking about zoning at the city or town level, as opposed to like these small, like local neighborhood decisions, it's easier for organizers. It makes sense to sort of for housing supporters to show up. And so yeah, I think we did see in a number of places sort of exciting organizational victories.
I'll just add, and you know this, Rachel, Jesse from Abundant Housing, key partners in helping at the local level. I think some people don't love the idea of the state telling them what to do. Like that's a key piece of the argument in places that haven't adopted housing. And this, we were not in office when this legislation passed. It had near unanimous support in the House and the Senate. I think unanimous in the House, almost in the Senate. And that just says to me, we've got work to do for folks to understand how they're part of a collective. We're not 351 separate cities and towns when we're thinking about housing policy. You control local zoning, yes, as well you should, but we also need to be thinking about the broader introspection around how we build housing. So for us, it's try to incentivize that. You know that we've got a lot of programs to support infrastructure. There are really important reasons as to why housing doesn't get built. There's not enough water or sewer, or there's a challenge around an infrastructure need that is going unmet. And this is an opportunity to get that need met while also meeting our housing. So talking more in that lens, this isn't a have to, this is an opportunity, I think would be helpful as we think about how we translate this statewide housing policy into local language.
Sony, can I
Yes,
just
please.
one other thought to
Ask
that?
if
Around MBTA communities, I've always been a little worried people have their hopes set too high for the amount of housing it's going to produce. One thing I still genuinely really support the law and think it's been great. For me, maybe the biggest positive surprise is the pro-housing infrastructure that's sprouted up here. And so just building on what they've said, it's not just that there was great local organizing to support plans that have largely passed the region, but those pro-housing groups now exist as standing organizations in dozens of municipalities in Greater Boston who are going to be there for the next housing initiative into the future. And that's what we're going to need to build on MBTA communities to get more homes in the pipeline to really actually build the 220,000 plus.
Yeah. Luke, you've also raised something really important. Like in Milton, we saw this. When the zoning would allow for up to 3,500 units, like it was not going to be 3,500 units in a year, right? This is a 10, 20 year kind of perspective of what that might look like. And if you broke it down to, maybe you'll see 150 units in a year, it's way more manageable. But how communities grow and how development happens, the average person just hears 3,500 units, where are all those people going to go, and doesn't always think of it as a 10, 15, 20 year smart growth plan.
I'm just going to chime in here to say that we are thrilled to have the Lieutenant Governor, and I know that she has an appointment right after this one, so I just want to recognize that she might need to leave when she needs to leave. So, so thank you all, and part of this is really underscoring the work of the organizations that have been building that capacity at the local level. So thank you. Yeah. All right, next question.
Hi, Chris Norris from Metro Housing Boston. A question for Luke and then maybe a suggestion for Maxwell and Catherine. Luke, during your presentation, one of the things you mentioned about families and homelessness was not knowing what happened to the families that led to that significant decrease in the shelter population and motel population in particular. Is your organization going to be looking at that? And then building off of Lieutenant Governor's comment about data-driven policy, Catherine and Maxwell, a suggestion that maybe, if you're not already doing it, perhaps looking at the comparison of some of the other opportunities that we've had over the years, 40R, 40B, MBTA communities, who's being served by each program, how many units have been built, at what cost, how quickly, might be a great next step.
The short answer on the indicator side is yes, we are eager to keep tracking this. The homelessness story in Greater Boston is a really troubling one. We have among the highest homelessness rates for any metro area in the country. That is paired with a somewhat good news, or maybe it's a silver lining, which is that the vast majority of those families have been in shelter. And so like I said in my presentation, the big question is if the shelter caseloads are going down, is that because just the demand for shelter is really down? We hope so and want to just keep looking at that. But it's important to make sure that we aren't shifting families into unsheltered homelessness instead.
And it's just, thank you for the suggestion about comparative policies. 40B has been one of the great producers, I think, of affordable housing and market rate housing in the state, especially if we look at sort of what has been produced in our suburban communities. And so I think as we have more years of data from MBTA communities, right now it's too early, right? Units are mostly permitted and in the pipeline. But I think it's a great suggestion to think about sort of going forward, which of these have produced the most housing and for whom. And how might we sort of design state policies to reflect that evidence going forward?
We have a question on this side.
Thanks. Brandon Stanaway at MAPC. Do we have any fire or building commissioners in the room? Excellent. Perfect. Well, we should have more of them because I think part of the question, we're addressing zoning, but building and fire codes are also equally as important to figuring out the housing story. We have a single stair bill that's going through the legislature. How are we thinking about organizing around building and fire codes and addressing that at the state level, changing building and fire codes there, and also organizing around it at the local level to show people that a single stair building isn't going to ruin your neighborhood?
I think that's a question for you, Lieutenant Governor.
I really appreciate that, and I'm glad you raised them. And I want to thank the Globe for editorializing on a number of these issues that where either Massachusetts is a bit of an outlier, and there may be opportunities for us to engage in a thoughtful way. Around modular, it's sitting down with our folks in labor and understanding how this is something that might build housing and support crafts and trades. I say that as a wife of a union bricklayer. And around things like single stairs, how do we engage with our fire and building codes? We've come a long way in other places with sprinklering of buildings and things like that, and it may be time to look at that. That can't happen with a conversation over here and a conversation over here with advocates over here and building and inspectional officials over here. Opportunities for commissions to come together to really study this. And are there ways that we can either alter those, run some pilot programs? We are hoping to build innovation into how we think about housing. There is a lot happening in building materials that also are things that our inspectional services facilities and public safety facility personnel may not be aware of, or maybe an opportunity to engage more fully. We certainly hope to do that, and that really will be key, again, to making shifts or changes, putting people in the room around the table, helping underscore this trade-off argument with respect to the building the housing we need in the manner that is best suited and safe.
Anything you'd like to add, Luke, on the single stair piece?
Just appreciate the question. I mean, there's a growing recognition on the Boston Indicators team. We're thinking about other research projects beyond just zoning reform to look at angles for revising the building code. We released a report last year called Legalizing Single Stair Housing in Massachusetts that explains the issue. This might be a new issue for some folks, but the building code in Massachusetts requires any mid-rise buildings between 3 and 6 stories to have 2 modes of egress, 2 staircases, and that really boosts the cost of construction for mid-rise housing. And with advances in fire safety, sprinklers, better material requirements, it's quite likely that you could still have a perfectly safe 6-story mid-rise home without 2 staircases, and that could be the kind of thing that could help us move the needle too. So the question reflects, I think, a growing recognition, not just here but nationwide, that we need to work on zoning reform and a bunch of other permitting issues at the same time.
Agreed.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a question here and here. Greg was mentioned in the report.
Thank you. My name is Greg Wheatman with the Charlesville Regional Chamber. We represent Newton, Needham, Wellesley, and Watertown, so I had some PTSD this morning. I think the one thing to mention about Wellesley as well, that it was their goal to pass town meeting. It passed by 90% or so, and so they could have tried for something that passed for 60%. But my question really is, what are, besides the staircase idea, what are the top-down ideas, that some of which are in the report, the housing report that was done, that we really favor and should be behind next? What are the next top-down ones?
I'll just say, maybe Lieutenant Governor, maybe Katie Max, that was part of the driving force for this special topic, was to see how we could succeed in furthering legislation. What were other ambitious goals for legislation, and to understand what worked and didn't work so that we can be more ambitious down the road. So any thoughts to share?
I think one challenge with local autonomy is exactly sort of what our report points out, and sort of what I think you pointed out really well, which is that when we allow communities to decide how much housing they're going to build, some communities are really excited about that, but I think we've now learned pretty clearly from the empirics, a lot of communities are not excited to build that. And so it may require, fundamentally, I think there's going to be a tension. The more we allow for local autonomy, potentially the more unequal compliance with state laws will be, and the more unequal sort of the development that we're going to see from those opportunities are. Obviously, the trade-off is that when you have more of a top-down approach, you can get more opposition in the state legislature, you can get more resistance from local officials. But I think fundamentally, one lesson I take away from MBTAC is that maybe an approach that is a little more of a strong state stance on what needs to happen might make for a more effective policy. And I think about something like the accessory dwelling units as potentially leading to sort of more even development across communities. But
I'm going to have to check out, or I'm going to be really in trouble. But I'm going to just say one thing. Greg, thanks for all the work you're doing leading the business community. I have really found business community folks don't typically show up at a council zoning meeting, and when the local coffee shop owner comes in and says, hey, this is important zoning, or this is an important tool, they get a little bit more attention than just maybe our housing zealots do at times. So I want to say thank you for leading that effort in the business community. I think we talked about some of the things that should be on the list here. Many of them are in the Unlocking Potential report, from modulars to single stairs to office to residential conversion, real opportunities for us to sort of think about how we do something at an omnibus level. Lots of our suburban communities have sort of white elephant buildings. We know there are some here. How do we make it easier to convert those ones that we can on a faster timeline? In addition to the existing tools that we have, we should be putting ADUs on steroids. How do we work with housing authorities, state-owned land, some of the things that we're moving on, but we just really had the license to do that with the adoption of the bill. I also think, what are the carrots? How do we make it easier for people to build housing and not have it be just, I'm not going to get state funding in MBTA communities? What's the plus that you're getting? How do we fund MSBA in new schools? Like, how do we put communities who are building housing in the driver's seat to do this, because it's going to provide benefit to their community beyond just the hearts and minds piece, the economic piece of it. So I think there are carrots and sticks that we can utilize, and I think we're very open to that discussion and to leading that effort. We're not done on housing. The Affordable Homes Act was a big investment and a big policy shift, and we're glad and we're implementing it, and we worked hard to get it there, but that is not it. It is going to take more innovation, more chutzpah, and more really good ideas coming together to be implemented for this to work in Massachusetts. So thanks, everyone. Got to run.
We're not done on housing.
Can I add one thing on that?
Yes, please.
So one last thing on that question is the approach we took with MBTA communities is incrementalism. It's let's add a little bit more zoned capacity in these towns and sort of work up a little bit. But if we're trying to get to a target, we're sort of inching our way, we're never going to get there, not with any speed. When we first looked at Lexington, we thought, is this a success or not? Because they rolled back what they did. They went from a very ambitious plan to a less ambitious plan. But why did they do that? Because they actually permitted, and in the pipeline being built right now, a ton of housing. And so how can we think about policies that might overshoot the mark and then roll them back to get to our actual goals rather than inching towards our goals? So encouraging towns to say, if you zone too much, it's really easy to correct it and change your zoning later if you actually see a lot being developed.
Wonderful. Maybe one or two more questions. Here and here.
Hi, yeah, Andrew McCula, Pioneer Institute. Luke, as part of your presentation, you broke out the kind of cost to buyers of entry-level housing, and I found that angle really compelling. I guess my question is, are there other parts of the country or other regions in the country that are better at building new entry-level housing, making those entry-level homes available at a given time, keeping them low cost? And if so, what are the kind of indicators of that happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first state that comes to mind for doing just innovative statewide reform, it relates to some of this back and forth we were just having around how much do we leave it up to municipalities to design local plans versus having the state preempt local zoning, is the state of California. So one thing they just passed, for folks interested in a contrast with the MBTA communities approach, SB 79, which just passed California, is a statewide upzoning of all parcels around transit at a much, much, much higher level than anything MBTA communities requires, and it preempts local zoning directly rather than relying on communities to do it themselves. So all different sorts of housing will be able to get built in those zones, but dense, multifamily apartment housing or townhouses are going to be the kinds of homes that can. We don't think of those as starter homes in the same way, but absolutely an apartment in a condo building can be a great first starter home for a young family. I don't know if Andrew is also leading a really interesting initiative to get a ballot question on the statewide ballot in Massachusetts to reduce the minimum required lot size for homes as an attempt, as I understand it, to legalize the construction of smaller homes on smaller lots. That really could be the exact type of starter homes that we haven't built enough of. So that's a great example too, and I genuinely appreciate your policy entrepreneurship to do that in Massachusetts.
Wonderful to hear. We have a question here. Any mics?
I do.
Oh.
I'm not that loud.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Maybe both of you can get your mics.
Karen Nicole Doman, Learning and Evaluation Consultant. Let's take the glass super full that the trend of production continues. We reached that 220. We're also really concerned about profound injustices in the housing market with respect to race, ethnicity, ability, income. What about the current policy practices will tend to some of that, or what else do you think could be put in place to try to undo those centuries of exclusion and violence?
Anybody here?
My question is similar. Is that okay?
Sure. Go
Okay. Tanya, City of Boston. So I was curious, based on the case studies that you talked about with MBTA communities, it seemed, correct me if I'm wrong, that the places that in fact got upzoned might have been the less affluent areas of each town or city. And so I'm curious, in those conversations at the town meetings or with the municipalities, how much were affordability requirements part of that conversation, so they could further prevent more inequities being exacerbated through gentrification or other unintended consequences?
Sure. Oh yeah, I was gonna say, if you want to talk about the, I was gonna say one place where I think about the state sort of showing a commitment to thinking about the fair housing implications and sort of what's going on. They have the new Office of Fair Housing, right? And I think that is a signal to me of sort of where the state is thinking about sort of inequalities and who has access to housing. But on this question of how much cities and towns were thinking about sort of equity and affordability, I think all of those cities and towns have inclusionary zoning requirements, and so the places that were upzoned because they were avoiding single-family neighborhoods largely are affected by those inclusionary zoning requirements. But I don't know that displacement and gentrification really mean the same thing in Lexington as they do like in the city of Boston, right? So I think the three communities that we were studying are not necessarily places. Clearly they're getting more expensive, but I think displacement means something different there than it does in other places. I don't know if Max, if you have other.
I think most of the places upzoned in all three towns were industrial and commercial areas, first and foremost, so no one living there right now. But I do think to the degree that we're excluding single-family neighborhoods, that definitely perpetuates the inequities that we have seen, and I think that's one of the troubling things we find here. If you only target multifamily neighborhoods and then commercial industrial areas, you're not going to address any of those inequities from the past.
Sony, the one other thing I'd add, especially to Karen Nicole's question, is Amy Dane, who recently joined Boston Indicators as a senior fellow, produced a great report with us a couple years ago called Exclusionary by Design, and it was the first really deep look at the intent behind the adoption of local zoning codes across Greater Boston. And she found, significant evidence of racist intent, classist intent, anti-immigrant sentiment behind the adoption of zoning codes, in the first place. And so there's a whole bunch of different things we're going to need to do to build the 220,000 unit target. But it's clear that one of the enabling conditions is going to be, scaling back those exclusionary rules.
So I know that this is the end of the conversation, but not the end, because as you know, we will build more homes and we will have to continue to fight for equity in the way that we build those homes and in who has access to those homes. So thank you for raising that. And thank you, Katie, Max, Luke, and the Indicators team, all of you for joining this conversation. The report is outside and available for you to take on your way back. But thank you for joining us. It will also be online, and there's a lot of municipal data for any of you who are from cities and towns and curious about how your town did. So thank you very much.